Before we begin, write in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. In 1897, on a November morning covered by a thick fog rising from the river, a 12-year-old boy woke up alone, completely alone. The house was silent. No noise coming from the kitchen, no movement downstairs, no creaking doors, no voices. Just the distant sound of the wind hitting the windows and the smell of cold ashes in the fireplace that had been out since the night before. The boy's name was Thomas Halloway, and when he walked down the stairs that morning, his bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, he didn't yet know that he would never see his family again. Not his mother, not his father, not his 2 younger sisters, not the 17 neighbors who lived along the same dirt road, cutting through a remote region of rural Pennsylvania about 20 miles from the nearest town. They were all gone. This case remained unknown for decades. It was recorded only in local archives, confusing letters sent to the county, contradictory statements from authorities who arrived days later, and sparse reports from an inspector who tried, unsuccessfully, to reconstruct what had happened that night. There were no bodies. There were no signs of violence. There were no signs of a planned escape, only absence, and a boy who woke up in the middle of it. The Halloway property was located in a region known as Cedar Valley, a narrow strip of farmland surrounded by dense forests of ancient pine and cedar trees, where the silence was so deep that any sound seemed to echo for miles. It was a place where time moved slowly, where the seasons were marked by the rhythm of farming, by the corn harvest, by the gathering of cattle before winter, where families knew each other by name, by generations, by stories repeated around the fire. There were 7 houses in all, 23 people, all connected by blood, marriage, or the simple need to survive together in that isolated corner of the world. The Halloways lived in the 3rd house from the entrance to the valley, a solid 2-story building with white painted wooden walls that were already beginning to peel at the edges, a porch in front, a small vegetable garden in the back, a barn where they stored tools, sacks of grain, and firewood for the winter. Thomas's mother, Margaret Halloway, was known in the region as a woman of few words but skilled hands. She sewed clothes for her neighbors. She made preserves. She cared for her daughters with a quiet, almost severe discipline, but one that everyone recognized as love disguised as rigor. His father, Edward Halloway, worked the land with the same persistence with which he breathed. He woke up before dawn. He returned when the sun had already set. He rarely spoke during meals, but at night, before turning off the lamp, he used to put his hand on Thomas's head and whisper something that the boy never fully understood. "Stay alert, boy. The world changes without warning." Thomas's sisters, Clara, 8, and Esther, 6, were inseparable. They spent their days playing among the trees, creating silent games with stones, sticks, and rag dolls. Clara was the most curious. Esther was the quietest, but both had the strange habit of stopping what they were doing and staring intently at the forest, as if they heard something no one else could hear. In the parish records of the time, there is a note made by the local priest, Father Augustus, 3 weeks before the disappearance. He visited the valley to bless a new house that was being built. In the margin of one of its pages, there is a handwritten line, almost illegible. "The children no longer sing." I asked why. No one knew how to answer. The community of Cedar Valley lived in a delicate balance. There was no store. There was no church. There was no police station. The nearest town, Ridgewood, was a day's ride away on horseback. Families depended on each other for everything, to help with the harvest, to care for the sick, to watch the children when their parents had to be away. But there was something deeper that united them, a kind of shared silence, as if everyone knew something that didn't need to be said aloud. In the months leading up to November 1897, some details began to appear in letters sent by Valley residents to distant relatives. A woman named Abigail Morrow wrote to her sister in Philadelphia, "The nights here are longer. I don't know if it's just my impression, but I have the feeling that the sun sets earlier than it should." Another letter, signed by a man named Samuel Greaves, said, "The dogs don't bark anymore, they just stand still staring at the forest. Sometimes during the night we hear something moving outside. But when we turn on the lanterns, there's nothing there. And there is a note found inside a Bible in the Halloway home, written by Margaret herself, undated. Edward says I'm imagining things, but I swear I heard someone walking upstairs. When I went up, there was no one there, just footprints in the dust. On the night of November 27th, 1897, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Dinner was served. The children went to bed. Edward extinguished the lamps one by one. Margaret locked the doors as she did every night. Thomas heard the creaking of the floorboards in the hallway as his parents went upstairs to their bedroom. He heard the low murmur of voices talking before bedtime. He heard the silence that followed, and then he fell asleep. When he woke up, there was no one else there. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back a few months in time, back to the summer of 1897, when the valley still seemed like an ordinary place, when families still gathered on their porches at dusk, when children still played fearlessly among the trees, when everything still made sense. Thomas Halloway was an observant boy, quiet, almost invisible amid the adults' conversations, but he paid attention. He memorized details. He kept things that no one else seemed to notice. He remembered, for example, that in August his mother started locking the front door even during the day, something she had never done before. When he asked why, she simply replied, "I prefer it that way." He remembered that his father stopped going to the neighbor's house at night. Before, it was common for Edward to walk over to Samuel Greaves's property to play cards, smoke his pipe, and talk about the harvest. But suddenly, he stopped. He would sit on the porch, staring at the empty road until darkness swallowed everything, and he remembered that his sisters had stopped playing in the woods. Clara, who used to spend hours exploring trails and building huts out of branches, began to refuse any invitation to leave the house. When Thomas asked her what had happened, she looked at him with a seriousness unusual for an 8-year-old and said, "The forest has changed." Changed how? She didn't answer. She just looked out the window at the trees in the distance and murmured, "There's someone there." In the records left by Father Augustus, there is a detailed description of a visit he made to the valley in September. He had been called to bless the home of a family named Peterson, who had lost a young son to fever a few days earlier. But what he noted in his personal journal was not about the burial. It was about the silence. "I walked along the main road of the valley at noon. I didn't hear a single bird. I didn't see a single child playing. The doors were all closed. The curtains were drawn. When I knocked on the Petersons' door, it took almost 5 minutes for someone to open it. And when they did, it was only a crack, as if they were afraid to let me in." Further on, he wrote, "I asked Samuel Greaves if something was wrong. He looked at me with sunken eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days, and said, 'Father, can't you feel it?' I asked what I should feel. He just shook his head and closed the door." Thomas remembered one night in October. He had woken up thirsty and gone down to the kitchen. As he passed through the living room, he saw his mother sitting in her rocking chair, motionless, staring at the front door. She wasn't sewing. She wasn't reading. She wasn't doing anything at all, just staring. "Mum?" She turned her face slowly, as if she had just realized he was there. "Go back to bed, Thomas. Why are you awake?" She hesitated. Then, in a low, almost inaudible voice, she said, "I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" She didn't answer. She just looked back at the door. The changes in the valley were subtle, small, almost imperceptible when viewed in isolation, but together they formed a pattern. The dogs stopped barking. The horses grew restless in their stalls, stamping their hooves on the ground, whinnying softly throughout the night. The chickens stopped laying eggs. The children stopped playing outside, and people began to sleep less. In statements collected weeks later by a county inspector, there are reports that several families began to keep oil lamps lit throughout the night. Some locked their doors with reinforced wooden bolts. Others simply did not sleep, taking turns keeping silent watch. But no one could explain why. When asked, they always gave the same answer. "It's just a feeling." There were also the sounds. Thomas remembered waking up several times during the night and hearing something outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something that moved slowly, something that seemed to walk along the dirt road, stopping in front of each house as if it were waiting. He never told anyone about it, because he knew his parents heard it too. He could see it in their eyes. He could see it in the way his father held the rifle leaning against the bedroom wall, even though he had never used that gun in his entire life. One night, Clara came into Thomas's room and lay down next to him, trembling. "Did you hear that?" "I did." "What is it?" "I don't know." They were silent for a long time. Then Clara whispered, "I think it wants to come in." In late October, one of the neighbors, a man named Jonathan Wick, showed up at the Halloway's door in the middle of the afternoon. He was pale, sweaty, talking fast, almost breathless. He said he had seen something in the woods, something big, something that moved among the trees but never appeared completely, something that seemed to be watching. Edward Halloway listened to him in silence. Then he put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Go home, Jonathan, and don't go out at night." Jonathan looked at him with wide eyes. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Edward didn't answer. He just closed the door. In the last week of November, the families in the valley stopped visiting each other. Each locked themselves in their own homes. Each began to live as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Thomas noticed that his mother began to cook larger portions of food, as if she were preparing for something. She filled jars with preserves. She stacked firewood inside the house. She stored water in buckets. When he asked her why, she didn't look at him. She just kept working and said, "Just in case." On the evening of November 27th, everything seemed normal. Dinner was served in silence. Margaret put bread, boiled potatoes, and salted meat on the table. The girls ate slowly without talking. Edward chewed with his eyes fixed on the window, where darkness had already swallowed the entire valley. After dinner, Margaret took the girls upstairs. Thomas heard the creaking of the stairs. He heard the murmur of a prayer being said softly. He heard the sisters' bedroom door closing. Edward turned off the lamps one by one. He checked the door locks. He went upstairs. Thomas lay in the dark, listening, and then, without knowing why, he fell asleep. When he woke up, the sun was already high in the sky, and there was no one else there. Thomas woke up with the sunlight shining directly on his face. That, in itself, was strange. His mother always woke him up before dawn. She always opened his bedroom door, called his name once, just once, and waited for him to get up. It was the routine, every day, without exception. But that morning, no one had opened the door. He blinked a few times, still lying down, feeling the weight of the silence around him. A dense silence, different, as if the whole house was holding its breath. He sat up in bed. He waited. He listened. Nothing. No noise coming from the kitchen, no creaking of floorboards downstairs, no voices, no movement. He called out, "Mom." His own voice sounded strange, small, swallowed by the emptiness. No answer. He got up. His bare feet touched the cold wooden floor. He walked to the bedroom door, opened it slowly, and stepped out into the hallway. His parents' bedroom door was ajar. He approached it. He pushed the door open. Empty. The bed was made, perfectly tidy, as if no one had slept there. The sheets were stretched tight. The pillow was in place. The lamp was off on the nightstand. But his father's coat was not hanging on the hook behind the door, and his mother's shawl, which she always left on the chair, was not there either. Thomas felt something cold run down his spine. He crossed the hallway to his sister's room. He opened the door. Empty. The rag dolls were on the bed, carefully arranged. The blankets were folded. Everything was in its place, but Clara and Esther weren't there. He hurried down the stairs, feeling his heart beating faster with each step. "Dad? Mom?" Nothing. The kitchen was spotless. The table was clean. The fireplace was out. The ashes cold, as if it had been extinguished hours ago. No trace of breakfast. No dirty dishes. No sign that anyone had woken up there that morning. Thomas went to the front door. It was unlocked. That never happened. His mother always locked the door, always, even during the day. He opened the door slowly and stepped out onto the porch. The valley was completely silent. No sound of animals, no sound of wind, no birds, no movement in the other houses. Just thick fog rising from the river, covering the road like a white, motionless blanket. He looked at the house next door, the Greaves house. The door was closed, the windows were dark. No sign of life. He looked at the next house, same thing, and the next, and the next. All the houses were closed, all silent, all empty. Thomas walked down the dirt road, barefoot, wearing only his pajamas. The fog was so thick that he could barely see his own hand in front of him. The ground was cold, wet. With every step he took, he sank slightly into the cold mud. He reached the Greaves house and knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Nothing. He pushed the door. It opened. The house was completely empty. There was no one there, but everything was tidy. The table was set. Clean dishes were stacked next to the stove. The chairs were in place. The beds were made. It was as if the people had simply left. But where? Thomas ran out. He went to the next house. He knocked on the door. No one answered. He went inside. Empty. The next house. Empty. The next one. Empty. He ran from house to house, shouting names, calling for his neighbors, for his parents, for his sisters. Nothing. Just the echo of his own voice coming back to him, muffled by the fog. In statements recorded weeks later, Thomas tried to describe what he felt at that moment. He said it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. It was the feeling that the world had changed overnight, that he had woken up in a place that looked identical to the valley where he had always lived, but that somehow was no longer the same, as if he had been left behind, as if everyone had left for somewhere he couldn't follow. He ran back home, stumbling through the mud, his lungs burning. He ran up the stairs. He searched every room again. He opened cupboards. He looked under the beds. He searched the barn, the basement, the attic. Nothing. It was only when he returned to the kitchen that he noticed something. On the table, there was a piece of bread. Just one piece, carefully cut, placed on a small plate. He hadn't seen it before. Or had he? He couldn't remember. Next to the plate was a cup. Empty, but it was still slightly warm. Thomas touched the rim of the cup with his fingertips. Warm. Someone had been there. Recently. Maybe minutes ago. He looked around, his heart racing. Mom? Silence. And then he heard it. A sound. Coming from above. A creak. Slow. Deliberate. As if someone were walking upstairs. In the hallway, approaching the stairs. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the stairs. The creaking continued. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. As if someone were coming down. He waited, breath held, eyes fixed on the darkness at the top of the stairs. The sound stopped. And then, silence returned. Later, when the inspector tried to reconstruct the events, he asked Thomas to describe exactly what he saw when he climbed the stairs at that moment. Thomas said he climbed slowly, that each step seemed heavier than the last, that the hallway was dark, even with daylight coming in through the windows. He said he looked at his parents' room. Empty. He looked at his sister's room. Empty. But when he looked at his own room, he saw something. The door was closed. He had left it open. He was sure of it. He walked over to it. He put his hand on the doorknob. He hesitated. And then he heard it. On the other side of the door. A breath. Low. Slow. As if someone were standing right there. Waiting. Thomas backed away. And that's when he heard the sound coming from outside. A bell. Distant. Coming from the direction of the forest. A bell. Ringing. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. In the official records there is no mention of any bell in Cedar Valley. There was no church. There was no tower. There was nothing that could produce that sound. But Thomas heard it, and when the sound stopped, he heard something else. Footsteps. Outside. Walking on the road. Slow. Heavy. Approaching the house. He ran downstairs, went to the living room window, looked outside. The fog was beginning to lift. And there, walking down the road, he saw a figure, distant, blurred, covered by the fog, but moving, coming toward him. Thomas stood frozen, watching, waiting to see who it was. The figure continued walking, slowly, unhurried. And then, it stopped, right in front of the house. Thomas couldn't see its face. He couldn't see the details, just the motionless silhouette, standing on the road, facing the house, facing him. They stood like that for what seemed like hours. And then the figure turned and began to walk back towards the forest. When the inspector asked Thomas why he didn't scream, why he didn't run after the figure, why he didn't try to see who it was, he replied, "Because I knew it wasn't anyone I knew." "How did you know?" Thomas hesitated. Then he said, "By the way it walked. It wasn't human." Thomas Halloway was alone in the valley for 3 days, 3 full days before anyone arrived. In the official reports, there is an attempt to explain why it took so long. The distance to the city, the lack of adequate roads, the fact that no one expected something like this to happen. But the truth is simpler. No one went to Cedar Valley unless it was absolutely necessary. And in those 3 days, Thomas did everything he could to survive. He ate what he found in the pantry: stale bread, canned goods, raw potatoes when there was nothing else cooked. He drank water from the well even though his hands shook so much that he spilled half of it before he could bring the mug to his mouth. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he tried to close his eyes, he heard the sounds, the creaking of the floorboards upstairs, the distant bell ringing in the forest, the slow footsteps walking on the road at night. He locked all the doors. He piled furniture against them. He sat in the corner of the room with his father's shotgun in his arms, a weapon he didn't even know how to load, but he held it anyway, as if just having it was enough. And he waited. He waited for his parents to return, for his sisters to walk through the door, laughing, saying it had all been a misunderstanding. But they never came back. On the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, he heard the sound of horses coming from the main road, getting closer. He ran to the window and saw 2 men on horseback, riding slowly, looking at the empty houses with expressions of confusion and suspicion. One of them was Father Augustus. The other, an older man with a grey beard and worn clothes, Thomas did not recognize. Thomas opened the door and ran out. The men stopped their horses. The priest quickly dismounted, his eyes wide when he saw the boy. "Thomas? Thomas Halloway." The boy couldn't speak. He just nodded, his legs almost giving way. The priest held him by the shoulders, looking around, searching for someone. "Where are your parents? Where are the others?" Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Finally, his voice hoarse from screaming alone for 3 days, he whispered, "They're gone." The man accompanying the priest was named Leonard Cass. He was a county investigator, not exactly a police officer, but someone sent when there were reports of problems in remote areas. Over the next few days, Cass walked through every house in the valley. He opened every door. He examined every room. He recorded everything in a worn leather notebook he always carried with him. And what he found left him with no answers. All the houses were intact. No signs of forced entry. No traces of violence, no broken furniture, no shattered windows, no signs of a struggle. The beds were made, the tables were set, the clothes were hanging in the closets. Personal belongings, books, tools, dolls, combs were all in place. It was as if the people had simply gone out for a short walk and never returned. But there were strange details. In one of the houses, Cass found a pot on the stove, still with food inside, cold, moldy, as if it had been left there in the middle of cooking. In another, he found a half-written letter on the table. The ink was still fresh on the pen beside it, as if the writer had been interrupted, and in every house, without exception, the lamps were out, but the wicks were still warm. Cass questioned Thomas several times, always calmly, always patiently, but also with growing insistence, as if he expected the boy to eventually reveal something he had forgotten. "Did you hear anything that night? Screams? Horses? Wagons? No. Did you see any lights, any fires, any movement? No. Did your parents say anything before going to bed? Did they mention any plans, any trips?" Thomas shook his head. Cass looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something down in his notebook and sighed. "And this figure you say you saw? On the road? Are you sure it wasn't a neighbor?" Thomas looked directly into the investigator's eyes. "I am." "Why?" "Because I knew all the neighbors, and that wasn't any of them." Over the next few days, Cass organized a search. He brought in men from Ridgewood, Laborers, volunteers, people who knew the area. They combed the woods. They followed trails. They searched ravines, caves, hidden clearings. Nothing. No body, no clothes, no trace. The sniffer dogs that were brought in stopped at the edge of the forest and refused to go any further. Some began to whine. Others simply lay down, trembling, refusing to move. One of the men said he tried to force his dog into the forest. The animal bit him and ran back to town. There were also reports from those who participated in the search. A man named Peter Dunmore said that while searching deeper in the forest, he heard voices, low voices, murmuring, as if several people were talking at once, but too far away for him to make out the words. He followed the sound for almost an hour, but he could never get close. With every step he took, the voices seemed to move further away, until suddenly they stopped, and he realized he was completely lost. It took him 3 hours to find his way back. Another man named Isaac Thorne reported finding footprints, human footprints, barefoot, following in single file through the forest, as if several people had walked one behind the other. He followed the footprints for almost a kilometer, until they just ended. Not in a clearing, not in a ravine, not in any specific place. They just ended, as if the people had been lifted off the ground. At the end of the second week, Cass called Thomas in for a final conversation. They were sitting on the porch of the Halloway house. The sun was setting. The surrounding forest was beginning to darken. Cass lit a cigarette, took a few long drags, and looked at the boy. "Thomas, I need you to tell me the truth, no matter how strange it is. No matter if you think I won't believe you." Thomas said nothing. "What do you think happened to them?" The boy looked at the forest, at the dark trees, at the silence that now seemed permanent, and then he said, "They were called." Cass frowned. "Called? By whom?" Thomas didn't answer. He just kept looking at the forest. 3 weeks after the disappearance, Cass closed the case. In his official report, he wrote, "After extensive investigation, no evidence of crime, kidnapping, or planned escape was found. The families of Cedar Valley disappeared without a trace. There is no plausible explanation. The case remains open, but with no new leads to follow." On the last page of the report, there is a handwritten note. Small, almost illegible. The boy knows something he's not saying, but I don't know if it's because he doesn't want to, or because he can't. Thomas Halloway was taken to Ridgewood, placed in the care of a distant family. He never returned to Cedar Valley, and no one else did. The houses were abandoned. The land was left behind. Over time, the forest began to advance. Trees grew around the buildings, vines climbed up the walls, doors rotted, roofs collapsed, and the valley returned to silence. Thomas Halloway lived until 1963. He died at the age of 78 in a small house on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, surrounded by a family he had built over decades. A wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. He never spoke about Cedar Valley. When asked about his childhood, he would change the subject. When pressed, he would simply get up and leave the room. But in the last months of his life, when he was bedridden, when his memory was beginning to fail and his body was giving up, he began to talk. His eldest granddaughter, a woman named Claire, was sitting beside him one October afternoon when Thomas opened his eyes and looked out the window. "They're still there," he said. Claire took his hand, trying to calm him. "Who, Grandpa?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept looking out the window as if he were seeing something she couldn't see. Then, in a weak voice, almost a whisper, he said, "My mother, my father, my sisters, all of them, they're still there, waiting. Waiting for what?" Thomas closed his eyes, and then, for the first time in more than 60 years, he told her. He told her about the night they disappeared, about the silence, about the empty houses, about the figure on the road. But he also told her something he had never revealed to anyone. He told her that on the last night he spent alone in the valley before Cass and the priest arrived, he had left the house. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know what made him do it. But he opened the door. He went out onto the porch, and he walked. He walked along the dirt road, barefoot, under the moonlight, toward the forest. He wasn't afraid. He had no doubts. It was as if something was pulling him, calling him. He reached the edge of the forest. He stopped. He looked at the trees, and there, between the trunks, he saw it. He saw the lights, small, pale, floating among the trees like fireflies. But they weren't fireflies. They were something different, something that pulsed, something that seemed alive. And then he heard the voices. They weren't shouting voices. They weren't calling voices. They were whispering voices, soft, almost singing, like an old lullaby he couldn't recognize but somehow knew by heart. And among the voices, he heard hers, his mother, calling his name, softly, affectionately, like she did when he was little and woke up scared in the middle of the night. "Thomas, come." He took a step forward, and then he stopped, because he heard another voice, more distant, deeper, his father's voice, but he wasn't calling. He was saying something else. "Run." Thomas backed away, turned around, and ran. He ran back home, locked the door, piled up furniture, and waited, and never went back to that forest again. Claire was silent for a long time after he finished telling her the story. She held his hand, trying to process what she had heard. "Grandpa, do you think they're still there? After all this time?" Thomas opened his eyes slowly. He looked at her and said, "I know they are. How do you know?" He hesitated. Then, in a voice that was almost inaudible, he replied, "Because I still hear them." 3 days later, Thomas Halloway died in his sleep. In 1972, almost a decade after Thomas's death, a group of local historians decided to investigate the Cedar Valley case. They had read about the disappearance in old archives. They had found Leonard Cass's report. They had talked to descendants of families who lived in the area at the time, and they decided to visit the site. The valley still existed, but it was completely swallowed up by the forest. The houses had disappeared under the vegetation. The roads were covered with moss and leaves. There was no longer any sign that anyone had ever lived there. They camped on the edge of the valley. They took photographs. They made notes. And on the first night they heard it. The bells, distant, ringing 3 times. Pause. 3 times. Pause. One of the historians, a man named David Brennan, recorded in his diary, "I don't know where the sound is coming from. There is no church, no buildings, nothing that could produce that sound. But it's there, and we all heard it." On the second night, they heard the voices, whispering, soft, coming from inside the forest, and one of them, a woman named Evelyn Cross, swore she heard her own name. They left the next morning, and never returned. Today, Cedar Valley is completely abandoned. Modern maps don't even include it. The road that led there has been overgrown by nature. The few people who still remember the place avoid talking about it, but every now and then someone finds an old reference, a document, a letter, a yellowed newspaper clipping, and they try to find out what happened on that night in November 1897. But they never find answers, only questions. 23 people disappeared. 1 remained. Why? What made Thomas different from the others? Why was he spared? Or was he left behind on purpose? And if so, for what reason? To tell the story, to bear witness, to remember, or just to carry the burden of knowing that somewhere in that forest everyone is still waiting? In the county archives, there is one last document related to the case. It's a letter, handwritten, sent to Leonard Cass's office in 1898, almost a year after the disappearance. There is no sender. There is no signature. Just 4 lines. They didn't disappear. They just went where they were supposed to be. And when the time comes, we will all go, one by one, until there is no one left. Only silence. Thomas Halloway spent his entire life trying to forget. But there are things that cannot be forgotten. There are places that do not release those who have known them. And there are nights when the silence is so deep that we can hear, if we listen carefully, the distant sound of a bell ringing. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. And then nothing. Just waiting. If you ever pass by an old road, through a forgotten valley, through a forest where the silence is too heavy, pay attention, because maybe they are still there, waiting, waiting for someone to hear, waiting for someone to answer, waiting for someone to come. But if you hear the bell, if you hear the voices, if you hear your name being called softly among the trees, remember what Thomas's father said. Run.